Hello, my friends. Hello, and welcome once again to stately Vaughan Manor, where Roger and I have returned. Because it's Wednesday, that means it's Epic Comic Book Wednesday. Every Wednesday, we'll talk about a certain comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. Steve Donoghue over on his channel will talk about the same comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. It is our world's finest team up that we do once a week. And this week's going to be spectacular. It's going to be spectacular, Roger, because we're talking about the King of the Seven Seas. That's right. We're talking about Aquaman. Yay, it's Aquaman. DC's Man Under the Sea, Aquaman. I have here the Aquaman collection, Aquaman, a celebration of 75 years, the 75th anniversary collection that DC Comics printed a few years ago. Don't worry, I also have the 80th anniversary collection of Aquaman. Every few years you got to have a nice collection of Aquaman stories. I'll hold this one up because it's lighter. I don't have super strength like Aquaman. So let's talk about Aquaman. Aquaman, who came out way back originally in 1941. So Aquaman has been swimming around in the DC universe for a while, frequently not in his own comic book. He very often was a feature in another comic book, whatever comic book that might have been. He's been in a few as kind of a backup feature or just an individual feature in that issue of whatever comic book he was in. Then he would get, once in a while his own comic book, and then he would be inevitably canceled, and he would swim around someplace else. I'm actually not sure if there is an Aquaman comic book being published by DC right now. I lost track. Maybe. You never know with Aquaman. But let's talk about him. So yeah, he was created way back in 1941. Mort Weisinger created Aquaman. Mort Weisinger was asked by DC Comics in 1941 to come up with a few different comic book characters. He came up with Aquaman and Johnny Quick, I believe. Was it Johnny Quick? Yeah. And Green Arrow. So Johnny Quick, Green Arrow. Green Arrow's been around. He's been popular for many years. So the first Aquaman story was by Mort Weisinger and illustrated by Paul Norris. And Aquaman showed up and, of course, fought Nazis. Of course, you got to fight Nazis because it's 1941. Inevitably, Aquaman will be compared to Submariner, who came out a couple years earlier, I believe, if I'm remembering right. My memory's not so great, Roger, but I think Submariner came out for Marvel a couple years before Aquaman appeared. They are very similar in many ways, swimming around in the ocean, kings of Atlantis, that kind of thing. Their origins are suspiciously similar. But Submariner has always been kind of hostile to mankind. He became a Fantastic Four villain when he returned in the 1960s. Whereas Aquaman has always been a nicer character. He's a good guy at heart. Occasionally, he has had conflicts with the surface world. And his personality is altered here and there depending on who's writing Aquaman. But basically, good guy at heart. Aquaman. Nice fella. Family man. Got married. He was one of the first superheroes, if not the first superhero that I could think of that actually got married. Hawkman got married as well. You have a few characters that got married, but he was an early superhero to get married. He also had a child. We'll talk about that. It ended in tragedy. It was a sad thing what happened to Aquaman's kid. He also had friends. He ended up being the king of Atlantis, and he had Aqualad, his pal Aqualad. He's had kind of a tumultuous relationship with Aqualad here and there. But yeah, he had his teen sidekick, as well as having all his undersea animal friends. His powers, the power we usually think about when we think about Aquaman, he like Submariner, he can swim under the ocean, he could breathe water. He needs water to survive. He can't be out of the water for very long, again, depending on who's riding him. I have to say, DC Comics has retconned their entire universe so many times and changed it over and redid everybody's origin a dozen times. It's hard to keep track of DC characters and their histories, and Aquaman is certainly a victim of that. So when you're discussing Aquaman's history, it's kind of like, what exactly happened? You know, it can be difficult. So yeah, Aquaman, his undersea powers, he has those powers like Submariner does, but his most famous powers, of course, is that he can talk to fish and get fish to do the things he needs them to do. Now, whether he's just requesting, hey, help me out, fish, or whether he's controlling the fish, you do what I say, fish, it depends. I like to think that the fish are happy to help him out. Now, he doesn't just communicate with fish, though. He also can talk to whales. Whales aren't fish, but you'll very often see whales helping him out. Also, octopi, he'll have his octopus friend help him out. And occasionally a walrus, a walrus will feel sorry enough for Aquaman that he'll help out. So he can talk to all of these undersea creatures and ocean-adjacent creatures. That is his most famous superpower. He also, because he lives under the sea with his tremendous pressures, he also has super strength, right? And has super strength from the very beginning, actually, as evidenced in this panel here where he busts his way into a ship using his fist. But Aquaman's super strength has very often been forgotten about. You'll notice in his earlier stories, it's kind of hard to judge exactly how strong Aquaman really is. Because sometimes in these old stories, he will have clearly super strength, like when he's busting his fist into a metal ship. Or on other occasions, he'll just get knocked out by some regular person. And so it's hard to know just how strong this guy is. Because, he's had his embarrassing moments. There have been times when he'll just get knocked out. He was frequently knocked out, Roger, in his earlier stories. Surprised he doesn't have any kind of brain injuries. But yeah, he could just get knocked out by a regular person. And, it makes it difficult to know, well, how strong is this guy? It's become more clear in recent years that he actually is super strong. But really, he always has been. He's always had super strength. He's just never been as super strong, clearly, as like Wonder Woman or Superman or anybody like that. But otherwise, if he wasn't, he would just get crushed in the depths of the ocean. But Aquaman has always had tremendously fun adventures, and I think that was the appeal of Aquaman in some of these earlier Aquaman stories. So Aquaman was, had his consistent adventures for years and years. Stunning, thrilling adventures, like when Aquaman goes to college. Some of Aquaman's earlier adventures, actually, some of Aquaman's adventures for his first 20 years, or 30 years, or however long it was, could be rather silly. He had his sillier adventures. There's the whale that was wanted for murder, right? Wasn't that the one? Yeah, the whale that was wanted for murder. So, Aquaman had a ton of fun adventures. And like I said, eventually he teamed up with Aqualad, and him and Aqualad had fun times. Aquaman's origin was retconned, I think, at least once or twice. When Aquaman first showed up, he had a tremendously vague origin. Let me see if I could find it. Yeah, so his dad was like a scientist, and he just had a kid and just hung out with his kid underwater. Yeah, so Aquaman tells the story of his father here. His greatest discovery was an ancient city in the depths where no other diver had ever penetrated. My father believed it was the lost kingdom of Atlantis. He made himself a watertight dome in one of the palaces and lived there, studying the records and devices of the race's marvelous wisdom. From the books and records, he learned ways of teaching me to live under the ocean, drawing oxygen from the water and using all the power of the sea to make me wonderfully strong and swift. By training and 100 scientific secrets, I became what you see, a human being who lives and thrives under the water. Yeah, so using strange ancient Atlantean scientific secrets, he turns his son into an underwater mutant. And that was Aquaman's odd origin in the beginning. Eventually, of course, that just didn't do, and his origin was retconned. But I probably won't be able to find it now if I look for it. Yeah, I probably should have found that. But basically, his origin changed later on in that his mother was actually an Atlantean who went to the surface world, met a guy, they fell in love. She was exiled, I believe. And he had an origin very much like Submariner did. Eventually, like Submariner, he became the king of Atlantis. So Submariner and Aquaman did have a lot of similarities as characters, and their stories were pretty similar as well as far as that goes. But like I said, Aquaman's character is very different. For many, many, many years, he was just a fun character. And I think that's why he continued to be read, even when he didn't have his own book. He kept appearing year after year, just because his adventures were fun. They were just fun. You know, he hung out with fish. It was a good time. And for the years when mostly children read comic books, children that eventually grew up and demanded more sophisticated comics. But for years and years, you know, if you're a kid, Aquaman's a fun character. Of course, years later, Aquaman became the character to be ridiculed at DC Comics because basically he was the guy who talked to fish. And many people considered Aquaman to be lame. But in came Peter David, who recently passed away. And Peter David did transform Aquaman. There's Aquaman. He gave Aquaman the long hair and the beard. And he also took off Aquaman's hand. Yeah. I think it was piranhas that ate his hand. Now, how that happened, I can't remember. It's been too long since I've read the story. But, yeah, there's a scene where Aquaman's hand is eaten away. And there you have Aquaman's messed up hand. And eventually Aquaman just became a character with a harpoon for his hand. But even before Peter David got to Aquaman, though, Aquaman had some tough times and had some more serious stories, particularly in the 1970s. My good friend Steve Donoghue in his video will doubtless bring up the Stanley virus. The virus, Roger, that infected comic books. Because Marvel Comics were so serious compared to DC Comics, as far as having realism and real-life consequences in their comics, Marvel Comics were tremendously popular. And DC Comics were starting to feel the heat from Marvel and had to change. They felt they had to change. And in very DC fashion, they overdid it as far as their changes were concerned sometimes. So DC Comics, which could be quite villainous in the 1970s, really targeted Aquaman for tragedy. And out of all the characters at DC Comics, yeah, Aquaman probably got the worst of it. So Aquaman, who had just been this fun character for years and years, that wasn't enough to sell comic books anymore, to sell Aquaman comic books. So DC decided to do something very nefarious. And it is collected, actually, I have the collection right here. Aquaman decided to kill, DC Comics decided to kill Aquaman's son, Aqua Baby. DC Comics, I guess they were sitting around going, Marvel, man, they're doing all kinds of serious stuff. They're even killing characters. I know what we can do to compete. Let's kill a toddler. And so DC Comics decided to kill Arthur Curry Jr., who lived only from 1973 to 1978. And as you can see, his wife is a little upset, Mara. My son is dead and it's your fault, Aquaman, as if he didn't have enough troubles. So this collection collects that tragic tale of when Aquaman's son was brutally murdered. Actually, it started off in a story. Let's see if I could find the cover of it. I can never find the covers when I want to find them. Yeah, here it is. Here's Aquaman versus Aqualad, which is, quite a surprising cover to find. But, that makes you want to read the issue for sure. But the story ends with Aquaman's child having been killed by Black Manta, if I'm remembering right from this story. So it was a real tragedy. Aquaman basically in these stories back in the 1970s kind of lost everything. His family fell apart. Aqualad left him because he was forced to fight Aqualad. And the threat was, hey, if you guys don't fight to the death, I'm going to kill your kid, which, his kid ended up dead anyway. And, Aquaman actually tried to kill Aqualad, or at least seemed to, and Aqualad believed he was trying to kill him in this fight, so he just left him right after his kid died. It was a horrible, tragic time for Aquaman. Why? And you think Aquaman was always such a nice fellow. Why make Aquaman suffer so much? For sales. But I think it was just way too much, killing Aquaman's kid. And this is when Jim Aparo was doing Aquaman. And I have to say, I don't like that they killed Aquaman's kid. But I have to say, some of these stories, these Aquaman stories from the 70s, were really, really good. They were good enough. I don't think you needed to make the decision to kill Aquaman's kid. But they were good stories. And the Jim Aparo artwork was really good. But, what do you do? I can't remember who wrote that story about Aquaman's kid dying. Let me see if I can find it. Paul Levitz. Yeah, Paul Levitz was the writer during this period. See, poor Aquaman. He really went through it. He had a hard time. Aquaman, however, in recent years had become more popular. Became part of the DC Comics movies, the ill-fated DC Comics movies. But the Aquaman in those movies was very much based on Peter David's Aquaman, I think. They had to make, because of Aquaman's reputation, they had to make Aquaman badass in those movies. And so we had a badass Aquaman I think he was in the Justice League movie, and he had a couple movies on his own. And he did all right in the films. Aquaman has been retconned now and again, because Aquaman's origin is always changing. And one of my favorites was, where is it? Yeah, this issue here. When Aquaman came back in the New 52, the New 52 was not my favorite thing. It was a very inconsistent thing, the New 52. It wasn't my favorite retcon. But they did a good job with Aquaman. And Aquaman came back in a story written by Jeff Johns and Ivan Rice was the penciler, and that was it. It came back in a really cool series where clearly in this one, Aquaman has his super strength back. If I mean, he never really lost it. I don't think he was always super strong, but you know, here clearly he's super strong. It was no longer quite as vague as it had been. But Aquaman, I kind of enjoy. I must like Aquaman because I've got so many Aquaman comic books lying around. I have quite a bit. And that was Aquaman. I think that's all I have to say about Aquaman. I just talked 20 minutes about Aquaman. That's more than anybody should really talk about our King of the Sea. But, you know, if you want more, go and check out my good pal, Steve Donoghue, where he will talk a lot about Stan Lee and Aquaman. Okay, guys, I will catch you next time.